Um, Again, welcome again today as part of our virtual Civic boot camp on COVID-19 and climate justice. We're going to be talking with Lylianna Allala, Climate Justice Director with the Office of Sustainability and Environment with the City of Seattle. Hi, Lylianna. And Jessica Koski, Washington State Policy Coordinator for the BlueGreen Alliance. Welcome, Jessica. And Jamie Stroble, Lead for Community Partnerships, Climate Equity, and Communications with King County's Climate Action Team. Hi, Jamie. So to start it off, I thought we'd just kind of lay the groundwork and talk about climate justice. So Lylianna, what is climate justice and how does it differ from environmental justice?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Jeff. So happy to be here. For me, I see climate justice as a sister of environmental justice. Climate justice is a form of environmental justice. I feel it's the recognition that we live within a fossil fuel powered economy that has benefits for few over the many, and I know that's complex. I'm glad to dig into that. I feel climate justice recognizes that this extractive economy disproportionately causes harm to low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, immigrants and refugees. And it's also a call to move away from that extractive economy to a regenerative one. So it's a shift in the way that we think about climate action by following the folks that are experiencing the most harm from the impacts of climate change.
Great, thank you. So based on that kind of discussion, let's talk about before the pandemic. Excuse me, Jamie, can you talk about like how marginalized communities in King County are impacted by climate change just prior to the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. So climate change is going to impact specifically in King County. We're going to see things like sea level rise and hotter, drier summers, wetter winters, more extreme weather events. There's some increased risk of wildfires. We've noticed over the last 5 years or so that we've almost now have essentially a wildfire smoke season. And then there's impacts to ocean acidification, what that means for our shellfish industries and the jobs that rely on some of those things. And when you look at just like the environmental impacts overall, there's also what are the repercussions of all of that? And essentially, we have communities that are not going to experience those impacts in the same way, right? And this is dependent on the resources available. There's also dependent on historical decisions that were made around where people live and can afford to live. There's also impacts around health conditions, and we know that that overall climate change is going to disproportionately impact and exacerbates existing inequities in our systems. And so we know that that this is primarily disproportionately impacting communities of color, immigrants and refugees, low-income communities, those with pre-existing health conditions, and we're starting to kind of see what that looks like with a lot of well, I won't go into too much detail yet because I know you're going to ask what that means now as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jamie. Jessica, I know you work with the BlueGreen Alliance and work a lot with labor unions and workers. Prior to the pandemic, what would you say is the impact of climate change on workers?
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, it's really fantastic to be here. The BlueGreen Alliance is really excited to be a part of this conversation. And as you said, we work with a host of unions. And then I think sort of as you've heard from Jamie and Lylianna, I mean, the impact on workers sort of isn't equal across the board. You know, it's sort of certainly going to vary sort of by a whole host of factors. There are certain sets of workers that are extremely vulnerable to climate impacts. You can think about sort of the farm workers here in Washington that have to endure our wildfire season and working outside in smoke. or construction workers, others that are really susceptible to extreme heat. So there are certainly sort of sets of workers there that are extremely vulnerable to climate impacts. There's also those that are really vulnerable to the impacts associated with the policies that we pursue to address climate change. Thinking about sort of workers, that are really dependent on our fossil fuel infrastructure and what it means for them as we transition away from that type of infrastructure, or the communities that are built around that infrastructure, or those that sort of in low-income households that might be impacted by policies that could increase fuel prices. So there's sort of an array of different impacts. And I think the thing that's important to understand is sort of how much those impacts are exacerbated by a really unjust economic system that underpins the landscape of employment here. And so thanks to sort of really concerted attacks on worker rights, attempts to increase corporate power at the expense of workers, our economic system is really dominated by, sort of low wage, low benefit work, which ends up increasing income inequality, but also producing a really large population of working poor individuals and families that aren't resilient to any types of shocks. And so whatever impacts they might feel are made that much worse by the fact that they're sort of operating in this unjust system.
Thanks, Jessica. Lylianna, how would you respond? Prior to the pandemic, how are people, especially in Seattle, marginalized communities impacted by climate change?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what Jamie and Jess have already expressed so eloquently. I think what I would add is that in Seattle, 13 of the 14 heaviest industrial polluters are located within a half-mile of places where communities of color, immigrants, refugees, and low-income communities live. And so these are areas with poor air quality and industries that are contributing to increases in CO2 that impact the health and well-being of folks who, in comparison, are minimally contributing to climate crisis, the climate crisis. So, these low-income communities and communities of color are often located near highways, under flight paths, have less dense tree canopy, or are located in not in close proximity to quality open space. So all of that exacerbates the impacts of climate change generally, but especially to the health of people.
So I'll stick with you, Lylianna. Which communities specifically have been impacted, and then why don't you transition to the pandemic now, and what's impacting them?
Yeah, I think our neighbors that are living in South Park and Georgetown clearly are being impacted. Folks that are living in Beacon Hill are doing some really great work to explore the impacts of poor air quality to their communities. So those are some neighborhoods that I would point to specifically. And then in terms of the pandemic, that link to poor air quality and health is front and center right now when we're looking at COVID. So we know frontline communities are disproportionately impacted by climate change, and these are the same communities that are at risk of contracting and dying from COVID-19. And for those of us that have been working on environmental and climate justice or in the public health sphere, this doesn't come as a surprise. Something that I found super resonant for me as I was getting prepared to speak with y'all today was just looking at the Koski Foundation's website. They posit that climate change should be considered as a social determinant of health. Climate change exacerbates the inequities that are already existing economically, socially, and health-wise. And so when we're looking at information that's coming out linking exposure to air pollution, health inequities, race, and COVID-19, it just is glaring to us. I won't go into more information, but there's a lot of data right now that's emerging in terms of who is contracting COVID-19 and who is dying at higher percentages.
Thank you.
Can I
Jamie,
build off of that, Jeff?
Yeah, please.
So at King County, the public health department is a part of King County, and they've been managing a lot of the response to COVID. And they have a really great dashboard that's available if anyone's interested in tracking COVID information. And some of the things on there is a breakdown by race. And you'll notice that communities of color, particularly Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, and Black communities are getting higher rates of mortality and of contraction. And there's maps on there. There's a whole bunch of data that's being constantly updated on there. But I think what an interesting thing to draw from this that's important to recognize is if you look at the maps of underlying inequities, particularly at a county-wide scale, you look at poverty rates across the entire county, you look at air quality data across the entire county, you look at food access information across the entire county, you look at utility burden and housing burden, and you look at transportation access, and continually you will see that South Seattle, South King County is disproportionately under-resourced and disproportionately exposed, right? And then when you think like just geographically, what that means for folks that might need to move outside of the city of Seattle in order to afford cheaper housing, which means now they have to maybe get a car, and then the car they have to drive into work, and maybe they're an essential worker, and what does that mean in terms of exposure and the rates of resources and access to resources? The King County area is also one of the top 5 resettlement sites for immigrants and refugees in the country. And so we have a lot of folks where English is not their first language, and being able to have access to resources that are in their languages, that for them to have. And not all the jurisdictions have the resources to be able to provide those services in those many languages, right? We're also in a situation where a lot of jurisdictions are now having to grapple with big budget cuts coming down the line. And what does that mean in our ability to serve those communities too? I think that right now, building also off of what Lily was saying about air quality, is that a couple of, I think a month or so ago, Harvard came out with a study around the impacts of long-term exposure of poor air quality and it actually increases your, the mortality rates, the morbidity rates for COVID-19. And so, you know, several years ago, when we had a really bad wildfire smoke season, we would say, oh, get an N95 mask and protect yourself, stay indoors, try not to go outside. And now we're in this situation where people are already indoors, having to stay inside, and maybe going outside is necessary for your job or necessary for mental health. And if we get a bad wildfire smoke season this year, there's not only a shortage of N95 masks, but you're also going to not be able to go outside. And we're starting to see these two crises intersect in a very real way. And climate change is here, and an issue that that we have to be tackling at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Jamie touched on essential workers and folks having to travel to get to their jobs. What other impacts are there on because of the pandemic on the people you're working with? Oh, you're muted, Jamie or Jessica.
Great, thank you for touching that. I mean, certainly, I mean, I think there's sort of so much overlap in terms of the themes, you know, both in terms of the sort of the workers that are being sort of most heavily impacted now by COVID, or also those that stand to be really heavily impacted by climate, and that so often it's those that are already sort of the most economically vulnerable that are being the hardest hit. You know, and so certainly we have sort of the workers sort of on the front line, are essential workers who sort of, you know, have historically been some of the most sort of vulnerable, right, that are now the ones that are sort of risking their lives to make sure that the rest of us can keep ourselves safe. You know, and then sort of others who have just again, being some of the most economically vulnerable. So it's those that are already in a difficult position that are being hardest hit. And that's sort of what we see with climate as well. And certainly sort of the farm workers are a group of workers who really come to mind for me here, sort of fighting as we speak to have better protections at work, getting food to our shelves, but also some of those who have just been, we've already seen in past wildfire seasons, sort of giving their lives, and sort of stand to be sort of just doubly, triply impacted with a bad fire season. Sort of they're really sort of at the nexus here, sort of COVID, economic justice, and climate justice in so many ways.
Thanks, Jessica. So Lylianna, how have your programs been impacted at the city to try and working on climate justice initiatives? How have they been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, I feel like the pandemic's made our work in climate and environmental justice that much more critical, that much more important. The folks that I work with are amazing. This is our life's work. People are deeply passionate about this, and so it's been really inspiring to be in a place where everyone's giving their all to this. I think it's really taken the shape in a lot of different forms. Our office has been working really hard at making sure that folks who need access to healthy food can have that access. And so the city has pulled together a rapid program to get out emergency food vouchers out there. And I think the pandemic has just highlighted in a really critical way the role that food and the food economy has in our communities, and has really made us question the way that we've contributed to the food industry, and has demonstrated the intersection of climate and food and the pandemic. So I think we've been working fastidiously to pull together relief programs where they're needed, and then in terms of our climate work, we're thinking really hard about what are the bold strategies and solutions that we want to put forth to not slip back into a norm of something that the systems weren't serving us well before, and the pandemic has highlighted that. So I'm just really honored to be a part of a team that is thinking creatively about solutions that puts a vision out there for the collective well-being.
Thanks, Lylianna. Jamie, how about the same question? How have your programs been impacted by the pandemic, and how can you keep climate change or climate justice work on the forefront?
Well, I think that what COVID has done is really highlight that, systemic and structural changes are really needed to kind of ensure the safety, health, and economic well-being of all our people, but especially for communities that are being disproportionately impacted by climate change. It's a lot of the same folks that are vulnerable to climate change impacts are the ones being hit the hardest by COVID right now. And it's really calling to light the areas where our systems are weak and where we really need to be identifying ways to do things differently, right? One of the things that we've talked about is that this is an opportunity for us to rethink. It's not a transition back to normal, right? Because normal wasn't working for a bunch of people, and normal was not sustainable. Normal, we were on a trajectory to have even more carbon emissions than we ever had before, and we had people that didn't have a safety net, and this is kind of that wake-up call of we need a new way of doing things. In terms of like direct impacts to our work, we've kind of seen we've seen in many ways that this is like reinforcing the necessity of a climate justice and environmental justice lens to our work, that this efforts towards sustainability are not independent of this, that everything is interconnected, and that we have to have a holistic approach to this and really think about the connections to our other programs or other things. So some of the work that we're in the process of updating a 5-year climate action plan, and we were literally in graphic design work when stay-at-home order went into effect, and then we're like, oh my gosh, how do we pivot? Because we're having to, run, we have a climate equity community task force that's been helping to create a new section of our climate plan that's entirely climate justice focused. And how do we continue that work when a lot of our community partners have been redirected towards doing food drives and diaper drives and trying to just like meet the immediate needs of our community? But at the same time, those same folks are like, we still see this as so important because we know this threat is just waiting in the background and is the next thing that's going to show up. And if we're not continuing to take action on that, it's going to hit us harder later. We've also seen a lot of our public health staff that we're helping to work on climate change have all been repurposed towards COVID response. And so we're also, how do we move forward our climate and health work? How do we move forward our, those pieces of the plan when we're clearly dealing with an immediate threat, right? But I think that, folks are trying to carve out time, like half-hour blocks here or there to kind of help move it forward, because I'm so fortunate that everyone definitely sees like this is so connected and so important. And a lot of the same things that will make us resilient with COVID are the same things that will make us resilient for climate change. And I think the big question mark is still what are the budget implications, and how are we going to still tackle this, knowing that there's going to be some economic fallout coming through in the next year or two, and we don't know what that's fully going to look like yet. One of the other things I wanted to add that we have already passed this topic, but I feel like it was important to highlight, is we talked a little bit about the impact of climate change on mental health, but I think another thing that is important to note is that there's an impact on cultural loss as well. And that this is, as somebody who, I'm originally from Hawaii and I've been in Washington for about 15 years, but I work a lot with, other Pacific Islander communities and immigrant and refugee communities in South King County, where, there's an element of what does it mean when your homeland is literally being lost into the ocean, and you have folks having to permanently leave, and then your kids are never going to understand the cultural connections to the land. And then even more immediately in our area, for a lot of our indigenous and native communities here, when you're losing cultural sites into the ocean, or you're having to, traditional gathering places are no longer there, or the plants have moved, or the animals have moved, and everything is changing, that there's this element of loss there that isn't traditionally talked about in a lot of like environmental and climate spaces, that is very important for Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. So I just wanted to bring that back up before we moved on.
Jamie, I have a quick follow-up for you. I know you do a lot of work producing materials and such for folks who speak different languages. I'm wondering how you can provide information now during the time of Zoom when people may not have access to technology.
I think for us, what we do is we connect with our community partners that are the cultural connectors. And in many ways, it's not our response, it's not, the government isn't necessarily always the best messenger, right? We need to acknowledge that in many cases there is a historical distrust of government in some communities, depending on where they came from or previous experiences. And so we have worked on what we call Transcreation Projects, where you partner directly with a community partner to work together to develop communications materials, and then have them translated, and then work together with the partners to then give them out and make sure we're using culturally relevant examples. So, in our first climate infographics we had, this is before I started at the county 3 years ago, We had, one impact of climate change is decreasing snowpack, and there was a little icon of a guy on a ski lift, and a lot of our community members were like, one, I don't ski, and two, I can't afford to ski, and also, what is skiing? So we obviously not the best example for us to talk about. So we work together with our partners to be like, what is actually most meaningful and important, in order to talk about the ways you're experiencing this. And then we actually put like the logos of the organization so that they, were acknowledged for the work they put into this. And then, we say, how many copies do you want us to print? How much, can we give you those materials? And they actually are the ones utilizing it and getting that out to their communities, in their language. And so, and I think COVID has had some similar things where public health has been really proactive about trying to get materials and resources out in multiple languages, and the city of Seattle has been really critical in supporting that work as well. And that is actually, some of the materials I know are being used in other areas of the country that don't have the resources to do translation work. And that's, working to bring together folks who are able to kind of have that virtual connection to then be the ambassadors out to their communities. And I think that's been a critical piece of trying to make sure the word gets out.
Thanks, Jamie. So Jessica, what about you in terms of the Blue-Green Alliance? I know that on your website, you talk about you can have jobs and you can have a clean environment, a healthy environment. You can have both, but I assume that things have changed, or it's a challenge now with the pandemic. What are the impacts on your programs?
No, I mean, I think certainly, so the Blue-Green Alliance is a coalition of environmental groups, labor groups, community groups that sort of believe deeply and come together around sort of a commitment to ensuring that we don't hit the environment against the economy, that we need both a healthy environment and a robust economy, where folks can sort of take care of themselves and their families, and that sort of to suggest that we can somehow pick between one or another is sort of a false choice. And I will sort of say that stands true. COVID-19 has in no way impacted that, right? We all still need to be able, to feed our families, but also to have healthy air to breathe, water to drink, a livable climate. That, remains a false choice. I think for us, it's meant that the equity piece of that work is more important than ever, because it's sort of effectively through equity that we can actually achieve both. And so I think sort of historically, like the way that we have thought about our work is trying to tackle climate change in a way that's simultaneously creating good jobs. And, sort of over the last few weeks, months, what we've been sort of doing is working through what it looks like to flip that script and think about creating sort of good jobs, robust economic development that's equitable, while simultaneously tackling climate change. Because unless we're able to actually sort of, pursue those policies in a way that's sort of really creating meaningful, positive change, that's equitable, sort of really accessible for all, then we're not going to achieve that vision. And so I think sort of keeping, sort of remembering that this is really about sort of building the world that we want to live in, and sort of thinking sort of how we move forward with that bigger lens is sort of the piece that's really critical, right? And so that's where we're at right now with our work. Yeah, I should say, yeah, stop there.
Okay. So Lylianna, what lessons have we learned from this whole pandemic, and what do you think we can apply for the future to kind of be better prepared, I guess?
There are a lot of lessons. Just building off of what Jess mentioned, we need to invest deeply in our workers. We need to invest in the health of our people, in our communities, and we need to deeply look at different models of being, looking at living local economies that center the self-determination of communities, allow people to have the supports that they need to make the decisions that are best for them. I think we need to change the way our systems operate. It includes looking at local agriculture, eating lower on the food chain, supporting small local businesses, working in partnership with our labor unions and our communities of color, looking into cooperative business models, making large-scale investments in electrified mass transit. You know, the list goes on and on, but I think at the heart of it is prioritizing investments in community resilience and community ownership, and breaking down silos to develop systems-based solutions to make sure people have jobs to go back to that support their health and the health of their communities.
Great, thank you. Jamie, what would you say to that same question? What have we learned, and how can we be better prepared in the future?
I kind of said this earlier. We've learned that we need to really address kind of some of the systemic and structural changes. But I also think there's a few other takeaways that we've noticed. It's reinforced that, you know, preparing and acting urgently and boldly to this challenge, as well as to the challenge of COVID, is important. That we need to build community resilience, and that, you know, accurate data and science are really critical for informed decision making. That's kind of come forward as a big theme. And then solving complex problems requires collaboration across, you know, it's not just us working King County in a silo or the city of Seattle working in their silo. Both COVID and climate change are global problems that if we're not working in partnership with our surrounding region and other partners, we can't make a significant difference. You know, our climate plan is really unique, and that we have goals at two scales. So one is around kind of county operations, and this is like, you know, the buildings we own, the buildings we operate, the systems we own and operate. And then we have goals in there, and a lot of jurisdictions don't kind of take this risk, which is we make goals at a community-wide level, a county-wide level, that is things we don't directly control. Because if we were to just make goals, for example, on reducing building energy usage, and just the buildings we own and operate, that's just 1.7% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the county. Versus if we were to recognize that, you know, we need to reduce the overall energy usage of all buildings across all of King County, right? And so we've recognized, like, we're going to set goals around that, even though we don't control all of it. And we're going to try to form partnerships and incentives and work with other jurisdictions and work with our community organizations. And that's just the greenhouse gas example. But I think that, you know, in the section that I'm leading, which is a new piece of our climate plan, we're hoping to launch in the next couple of months, is focused on sustainable and resilient frontline communities, led by communities that are disproportionately impacted, so led by a task force. And they've identified 8 different areas that haven't traditionally been in climate plans, that are, you know, recognizing the intersection of climate change with housing and displacement and food security and food access and energy burden and utilities and all these things that, you know, transportation equity and community leadership, and what is access to decision making for those frontline communities? What does that look like? And how can we more meaningfully involve communities directly in policy making? And so there's, so that's like something that I was brought in to do, and building off of the work of the Environment and Equity Initiative that Lily and I both served on the original steering committee back in the day. But building off of the great work that happened with the EEI and trying to take that at a broader regional scale. And some of the things that are coming out of that is, like, we need to not only think about how we're involving communities directly in processes, but how we also prioritizing investments in a way. So similar to what Lily was saying, an example of what that looks like is, you know, Metro is thinking about moving to made a commitment to moving to 100% zero emission buses, which is awesome in terms of our greenhouse gas reductions. But they also did an equity analysis of how could we implement that in a phased way that would benefit those that are disproportionately impacted. So they overlaid, health impacts and air quality data and all this stuff. And it became clear that if you prioritize implementing in South King County, where there is worse air quality, less tree canopy coverage, more heat island effect, and all those things, that it would have a bigger benefit there. So we're going to have zero emission buses everywhere, but it's critical for us to think about how do we prioritize how we roll things out as well, and where we're investing. And then I won't go too deeply into this because I'm sure Jessica will talk about this, but green jobs is a big thing for us as well, and thinking about what does it mean to create pipelines for frontline communities directly into sustainable jobs. How can jobs be transitioned that are better for the environment? How do we not leave people behind as we transition? How do we protect our workers? How do we think about, and again, what Lily was saying too about our food workers? How do we support our local businesses and our local agriculture system? So I think there's a lot of synergies that we're thinking about that are luckily in our region a common conversation across a lot of our partners and other jurisdictions, which I think is great.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Jessica, what's your response to the question of what lessons have we learned? And also, maybe, I think Jamie touched on it, but the term just transition, I don't know if you can kind of talk about that as we.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. Let me just make a quick note. I think more broadly, and in a lot of ways, this is sort of really echoing what Lylianna and Jamie already shared, but I think that, this crisis really underscores the need for us to be thinking holistically about climate change, sort of really, defining the problem broadly so that we actually have a range of solutions that become visible. I think climate change has often been sort of reduced to the need to cut carbon pollution. How do we get to 350 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, keep global warming, below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius? And the problem with defining climate change in these sort of quantitative, physical or sort of universal terms is that, it's blinded us from the fact that, a 1.5 degree rise in global mean temperature isn't going to impact everyone equally. That doesn't mean the same thing for everyone. And it's sort of, really limited what we think of as climate policy, to policies that sort of cut carbon pollution. And so that would be the equivalent of with COVID-19 sort of defining, what counts as pandemic response, just in terms of how do we limit new cases or hospitalizations, right? Which is obviously really important, but that's only part of the problem that we're facing right now, right? We sort of have to also deal with the array of sort of consequences and social crises that this has unleashed. Things like unemployment insurance, health coverage, dealing with preventing folks from having their utilities, shut off, expanding broadband so that, kids that haven't previously had access to internet, can now sort of be a part of schooling in this new world, right? And all of that counts as part of our response. And so in essence, sort of, I think that it's a moment where we can see really easily why bringing the climate justice lens to our work on climate is so critical, because ultimately the problem is a lot bigger than just cutting carbon pollution. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sort of hopeful that we can bring the clarity that we can see around that right now to our work moving forward. And then certainly sort of building off of Jamie's sort of pointing to green jobs, sort of and just transition. I think that we're sort of really seeing the fallout of a sort of really unjust economic system, that relies on a lot of very low wage, unstable work. And long term, we really need to be building a more resilient and fair economy. And we can start to do that. Actually, I'll back up and I'll say sort of a lot of the jobs that have historically been thought of as green jobs are actually sort of pretty poor, unstable, low-wage work, things like solar installation. But as we think about making these sort of investments, to build, sort of ourselves out of this into a new reality, we can do things like attach the workforce standards that ensure that sort of the jobs that come with green investments are good jobs. You know, things like prevailing wage, hiring locally from the communities where that work is done so that you're creating pathways for those communities into long-term careers, sort of apprenticeship utilization, sort of along the same lines, sort of really wanting to create career opportunities for folks and not just sort of a seasonal job. And I think sort of this is sort of really what's at the core of the notion of a just transition away from fossil fuels. You know, is that we don't sort of do it on the backs of, you know, workers that are sort of dependent on the fossil fuel industry, sort of, or on the back of anyone, right, that we're collectively sort of trying to build sort of a more just economy as we move forward. And that means making sure that the jobs that we're creating are good jobs, that folks have access to them, you know, and that you know, we're really, you know, ensuring, yeah, sort of, I guess the good jobs that everyone has access to is really what's at the core of that.
Thanks, Jessica. Lylianna, there's a question from the participants. Now that many traditional systems have been disrupted by the pandemic, what are some examples of work that each of your respective organizations have been able to do to reinforce and solidify that disruption for the benefit of climate justice and reducing climate change? That's a long question, but what do you think?
Interesting. You know, recently Mayor Durkan announced the closure of, I think it was like, oh, don't quote me, I think it's 20 something streets, 20 something miles of street. And I think that was a really bold move, bold in the sense that, you know, it serves a purpose right now in creating space for families to get out and connect with their neighbors, build or rebuild or repair those social networks and support systems that we so desperately need right now. And of course, there's ancillary benefits to that in the sense that, you know, that policy has been extended past COVID. And so, you know, it impacts or you know, I guess maybe the better framing is takes some more cars off of the street, encourages people to walk, and I think some really great work is being done to look at how do you use those streets as linkages, as safe pathways to get folks from their homes to parks or schools or you know, wherever they need to go, and centering some deep intentionality and racial equity lenses on that. So it's one example, but a really interesting one.
Thank you. How about you, Jamie? Is there any, do you have any examples?
This is a tough question,
It's a tough question.
because there's so many things. I think one of the things that stands out for me is that you know, this is such a huge disruption, and to what is normal, how we've normally operated. And I think what has been uplifting is that the response that our region has had has set some new precedents that, you know, when we were trying to think about like, how could you help with utility, you know, shut off bans or things like that, or how could you help with getting resources out to communities quickly, instead of having a really long grant process that takes forever and then you never get the resources. And how do we get food easily to people? Like, these are all things that have been tackled in a short amount of time, and all of a sudden you have a precedent now of like, oh, if we have a climate emergency where the once in 100-year flood, which is now projected to become much more frequent than that, we have these tools now at our disposal to be able to say like, all right, you know, while we're dealing with this crisis, these are some things that we can look at. And I think that's been one kind of uplifting thing in this. One of the other things I think about is that in terms of how we're prioritizing things, you know, the reality is that a lot of our jurisdictions are likely to see budget cuts, if not now, in the next year or two, right? And it really is going to come down to what are we prioritizing when we have to make some hard decisions. And what I've been heartened by is that equity and climate change in particular have been, that's not what we cut. And that's not the same decision that's being made in other jurisdictions across the country. In some cases, we have to cut, our sustainability program, or we have to cut our climate work because we have to deal with this thing. And this is the immediate threat. And I think what's been good about our local region is that you get leaders saying, these are tied together, and these are things that we have to continue to invest in. Otherwise, it's going to hurt us later. And so I think that has been a change that you don't necessarily see in other places across the country.
Thank you, Jamie. Jessica, do you have a response to that? The question about our systems have been disrupted, and what you've been able to keep disrupted, but for the benefit of climate change and climate justice. Oh, you're muted.
Here we go. I think that sort of Lylianna and Jamie have really already responded to that question pretty eloquently. I think just the disruption itself, is powerful, or the pause, I guess, the opportunity, to see, a lot of the problems that we're facing sort of were there before COVID, and now they're visible. And I think one of the things that I've been, or I should say, sort of visible for a much larger share of the population than they might have been previously. One of the things that's been really exciting and inspiring for me is to see how many of our partners, the groups that we work with, are really leaning into these questions around equity and justice, and recognizing that really has to be at the heart and center of their work. And I think a lot still grappling ultimately with what that looks like, but sort of doing the work to figure that out. And for instance, we sort of worked to have workforce standards attached to the clean energy bill that passed last year, in 2019, Washington's clean energy bill, which simultaneously incentivizes sort of clean energy developers to sort of have good workforce standards. And there have been times where you might have anticipated sort of pushback around that. That might create delays, it might make clean energy more expensive, and so we won't have as much adoption. And I think going into this new era, it's hard to envision sort of the same degree of pushback, just because I think folks recognize how important it is that we're actually building out good, solid work, that people have access to, sort of creating those career pathways. And so it's sort of just a lot of the awakening, I think, that's sort of in the process right now. I'm just excited to see how that plays out in a lot of our work moving forward.
Jessica, there's a follow-up for you, a question from a participant. Are there lessons learned from the pitfalls of a gig economy workers that could apply to a just transition for equitable green jobs?
Yes, is the short. A lot of, I think, so for instance, the gig economy, just to give folks, an example, you can think about Uber drivers, for instance. Or the Instacart folks. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing right now is just how vulnerable people are when you sort of have, sort of individuals take on all of the risk that would otherwise be sort of put onto an employer, right? And so those are folks that they don't have the same wage protections, they don't have the same overtime protections, they don't have the same access to benefits. And it creates a very unjust, but also sort of a system that's not resilient. Folks can't sort of deal with crises. And so I think that it's really clear that we need to be building out a more just economic system moving forward. And that takes sort of actually being really intentional and proactive. When you are creating new jobs, sort of taking the steps necessary to make sure that those are good jobs. Because if you don't take those steps, they won't be, right? They're sort of being formed, in a system where the default is to not be sort of a good career. And so sort of really just the need to be intentional and proactive and attaching sort of those workforce standards.
Great, thanks, Jessica. A question for you, Lylianna. Could you speak about the Growing Old project and what we can do to make the just transition to a liberatory 2020? Sorry, couldn't.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The Growing Old project is an amazing project I've had the honor to be a part of in partnership with Tamara Power-Drudas over at the Vida Agency and Colleen Echohawk over at Chief Seattle Club, and so many more amazing folks who have contributed to this. It's in many ways a multimedia project that explores the question, what would it look like for Seattle's humans and trees to grow old together in the next 50 years? And so it's a broad umbrella exploratory question that allows for a myriad of diverse stories to come up. The project takes the form of a podcast. Every Wednesday we have an episode that is released, and we have a couple more episodes for this first season, and we're contemplating the potential. Well, we're all really excited. Hopefully we can get into a second season, and we've got some work ahead of us to make sure that the folks that are contributing on the project are able to sustain and get paid. And so that's first and foremost for us. But the podcast is really centered an Indigenous perspective in looking at climate change, looking at the various impacts to humans and trees, and looking at the connection between those two. And so I've got lost in my romance with this project, so I can't remember what the second part of the question was, but I'm grateful for the question, and I hope folks do have a chance to listen to it. Many of my friends and colleagues have said it's been just a really poignant conversation that is happening right now amidst COVID, and in the midst of planning in terms of recovery and climate change. So I'm thanks for the plug. Listen to it while you're going on a walk or walking your dog or hugging your favorite tree.
Thanks. Jamie, another question, not kind of different angle though. What is your advice for someone early in their career in another field who wants to transition into a career in climate justice? And I'll just add that, as you I'm sure know, that the people of color are not well represented in the environmental movement or environmental organizations or government. So, so that's kind of a follow-up to that question.
Yeah. So prior to working at the county, I was actually a youth worker working with high school Asian Pacific Islander youth in the Chinatown International District, running an environmental justice youth program. And so working with young people, as well as making sure we get more representation and people into this field, has been really near and dear to my heart. So I kind of took that approach to the work that I'm even doing now. And I think there's several pieces of this where, for those of us that are in spaces where we want more representation and more people working on these issues, we need to be holding the door open for people behind us. And so for me, that has meant I've started our first kind of climate internship program that we didn't really have one before. I've gotten convinced our leadership to invest in that. I've also made sure to provide mentorship to up and coming folks in environmental work, and then making sure we're supporting programs. So part of our strategy before we even worked on the climate plan, I was like, we have to demonstrate that we're bringing value to community and that we are investing in community before we even ask for anything, right? So it's always about, so much is grounded in relationship building. And so I would say the number one thing for some of this is to build those relationships, to genuinely do your homework, to look and understand the topics, read up on it, and also then get to know people in those fields, get to figure out what your piece and your role is within that. It's really important to not just understand climate change, but to understand historic environmental injustices and how the intersections of institutional racism and the legacy of decisions that were made are impacting us now and today. and how those things intersect, and having a deep understanding of that, and then being able to continually be a learner in that field, right? We're never going to know it all, and everyone brings their own kind of climate story to this. Another piece to that is I like, we have to create pathways. And so some of our green job stuff isn't like, and this gets to someone else's question too, the way that we define green jobs has a benefit to the environment and pays a living wage, right? And that could be so many different jobs. It's not just I'm installing solar panels or I'm working on green building, which is a lot of ways we've traditionally talked about that. It's also, do we have folks that are scientists? Do we have folks that are working on policy? Do we have people that are working on environmental education? Do we have, and who is bringing a climate and equity lens to that work, right? We know that people of color are underrepresented in the environmental field in general. You know, and for me, I'm like the only person of color on my team. And so I was like, well, I'm gonna diversify that. So I brought in interns who now we have two. Like, but it starts with like creating that pathway, and then also getting leadership to invest in that and recognize that it's a priority. We have wait, I've gone off my trail of thought now, so I'm just gonna end there. Okay. I can see Lily smiling at me.
Well,
she's like,
we
yeah,
only have a few minutes left, so we only have a few minutes left, so I'd like to end with how people can get engaged with climate justice issues. So folks who may not be in their working world, we talk a lot about civic engagement at Seattle City Club. So how can people get engaged in this work? Jessica, what would you say?
Sure. Well, I will share out the advice that was given to me when I started on this journey, which was largely just to jump in and start somewhere. You know, there's a lot of work to be done. And so I think sort of finding, you know, an organization that's doing work that you respect and admire, sort of just reaching out and seeing how you can be engaged is the best place to start. And I'll say too, something that I've learned sort of in the course of my time doing this work, and especially sort of working in developing volunteer leaders, is that you know, there's just so much out there, and I think that it's really great to sort of see if you can find the thing that makes your heart sing in doing this work. I think folks are most impactful when they find that area where they're really passionate, and so sort of give some time thinking about that too, you know, to help you sort of start to narrow in on sort of those groups who are doing work that you really respect and admire, and then just jump in.
Thanks, Jessica. What would you say, Lylianna? How can people get involved?
That was so beautiful, Jess. I agree. I mean, one, you know, find your passion and find your story, and figure out, you know, who out there links to your own story, and where you can plug in and feel like you're a part of a community making a collective difference. I think the other thing that I would say, and you know, something that I recommend folks look at is the Hermes principles for democratic organizing. They were developed by 40 people of color and white folks working together in Hermes, New Mexico. They are really great principles. Off the top of my head, I remember the first one is be inclusive. And it kind of goes through how you can work in solidarity with communities that are most impacted in any issue. So, you know, I would say get familiar with that. And then if you're able to vote, use your vote. Support bold policies for climate change that center workers and center a healthier environment, and, you know, put that vote to use.
Thanks, Lylianna. You have the last word, Jamie. What would you say?
I think what Jessica and Lily both said are both really great. Building off what Lily said, you know, civic engagement and voting and who the leadership is makes such a huge difference. You know, climate change is one of the King County executives' top executive priorities. And if it wasn't a priority for him, it would be a lot harder to gain traction. It would be a lot harder to get investments, right? And so part of it is like, who is in a lot of our leadership roles, and how do we make sure that those folks are prioritizing and hearing the priorities that are coming from community, right? And that goes beyond just, you know, our immediate jurisdictions, but thinking about your own cities, your own, you know, counties you might be in, or even your state representatives. Like, are they reflecting the same values that you want as a priority? And are you making sure that that's being heard? And then part of it too, I think when you look at this from a climate justice lens, is the people who have traditionally had time and energy and the resources to reach out to elected officials, to write that letter, to lobby at the state, or to show up at someone's office, right? It takes a certain amount of privilege to be able to have both the language, to be able to speak English in government talk, to be able to have the time to go places and testify. That's where our folks, our communities that are disproportionately impacted often don't have that, right? Our council meetings, things are usually during the day, and people are working jobs, or they have childcare things, or so it's really important that that if you have that ability to help lift up the voices of people that don't, right? Then I also think like voting with your dollars is also a thing. Like, who are you supporting with your funds, in terms of the things that you are buying, the businesses you're supporting, the organizations that you're donating to, and really thinking about, how can I better support, you know, POC communities or POC-led environmental justice and climate justice initiatives, right? The best messengers of that disparity are the people who are being disproportionately impacted. So how can we help elevate their voices, right? I would also say that, you know, I reiterated this before, but doing your homework, like there's so many great resources out there in terms of what's already been talked about in terms of climate justice, environmental justice, and there's a lot of literature out there, and being able to like do that homework, so you can be a better advocate. There's also a lot of kind of, you know, traditional environmental spaces and in places where there isn't a lot of diversity in the room, the voice, the reiteration from other folks that equity is important, that climate justice is important, has to be heard multiple times to all of our leadership. And so so making sure your voice is being heard. And now we have, you know, a lot of things are happening virtually. And so right now, actually, we have a public input survey that's on our website around a climate action toolkit that is being developed. And I'm not directly a part of this project, but it's meant to be a guide for a lot of our outlying cities. So there's a partnership with the King County Cities Climate Collaborative, which is a coalition of cities across King County that have agreed to shared climate goals. And so that's currently up on our website, and I can send the link. We also, you know, with our climate plan, it's coming out, but it's not going to be, it's coming out, but it's also going to have to go through a series of processes to get reconfirmed and approved and all that. And so that's also a place to make sure that your voice is being heard if you think we're on the right track. And
well, thank you.
So I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamie. And I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time together. Thank you so much again, Jamie, Jessica, and Lylianna. It was great to hear from you and share your wisdom with us. I really appreciate that. Thank you to all the participants who signed up and attended. Really appreciate that. If you want to attend another Civic, event coming up, June 3rd is our last Civic cocktail with Mayor Jenny Durkin and Paul Guppy from the Washington Policy Center. So that's coming up soon. Thanks also to our Civic Bootcamp supporting partner, Alaska Airlines, who's really been helping us put on these programs. And finally, everyone, please take care and stay safe.